All right, so hi everyone. My name is Carlos Guzman. I'm a second year medical student, and today I'm also a part of the Latino Medical Student Association, or LMSA, and I'm joined here with another fellow student of mine, Olivet Martinez. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Oliva Martinez. I'm also a second year medical student here at KUMed, and I am the co president for the Latino Medical Student Association here at KUMed.
All right, so today LMSA will be hosting a community conversation specifically on two topics, but they're both pretty similar. The first one will be the differences, similarities between Hispanic versus Latino, Latina. And then in the second half of our presentation, we'll be talking about the use of Latino, Latina versus Latinx. Um, so we are also very fortunate to be joined by our moderator, Dr. Maria Alonso Luasis, who will be helping us field any potential questions that come up at the end. And also, speaking of questions, if you have any, you can go ahead and write those in the chat. And then at the end of the presentation, you can also type questions or ask questions. So let's just go ahead and get started. I am going to share my screen. So here we go. All right, let me get this PowerPoint going. All right, so the first thing is Hispanic versus Latino. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm sure we've all heard these terms used, and like, what does it mean to be Hispanic and or Latino? So they're often used interchangeably due to the high degree of overlap, but there are subtle differences, and I think that's what we're really going to try to highlight today. And just a disclaimer that these terms, of course, are all artificial. They were created in order to classify and collect data on people, and these are largely subjective / arbitrary definitions, and people self-report that they are Hispanic or Latino. And while there is no universally accepted definition, the most accepted one in this country is based on a federal law that was passed in 1976. And it described Americans who identify themselves as being of Spanish-speaking background and trace their origin or descent from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Central and South America, and other Spanish-speaking countries. This came from Public Law 94-311. And it was first this law was created by a U.S. representative from California, Edward Roybal, from California, and he was from the greater Los Angeles area. And this came about after several years of Mexican American and Hispanic organizations lobbying for government recognition. And they created this term because the U.S. needed a way to collect data on this rapidly growing minority population. And since the 70s, the Hispanic Latino population has grown to about 18% of the U.S. population, or 60 million people. And then since the 2010 census, both Hispanic and Latino are listed together on the ethnicity / race section of the census. So that can either simplify things or complicate things depending on how you look at it. And so the first part of that definition will be Hispanic. So what does that mean? So I am a big history and geography buff, so I like to go into the details of it. So Hispanic is actually derived from the Latin word Hispanicus, which means from Hispania. And that referred to the people inhabiting the Iberian Peninsula during the Roman Empire. So that includes all of modern day Spain and Portugal. And today, the term Hispanic generally refers to people that come from or can trace their ancestry from Spain or Spanish-speaking countries. So even though the Iberian Peninsula encompasses Portugal and Spain, Hispanic is typically reserved for people of Spanish or Spanish-speaking descent. And so this typically leaves out people from Portugal and by way of the Portuguese Brazilians as well. So because modern Portugal is located in the former Hispania and the Portuguese colonized Brazil, like I said, they are typically excluded from the Hispanic group. And so, let's see, I also thought it would be interesting to note that there is a small West African country called Equatorial Guinea that could be classified as Hispanic because it is the only former colony of Spain in Africa, and Spanish is still the official language. And so the next part of that two-word definition, Latino. So the definition of this term is strictly American. In Latin American countries, Latino can refer to anybody from any country in the world where the predominant language is a Romance language. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be using the definition of Latino as how we use it in the US. And that just refers to anybody from Latin America. It can be anybody from Latin American origin or descent. And so Latin America is a pretty vast geographical area. It is essentially any country in the Western Hemisphere where the predominant language is Latin-based. So this obviously includes every single Spanish-speaking country, Brazil, where Portuguese is the main language, as well as French-speaking countries such as Haiti and overseas territories of France. And here, I have a bunch of pictures. I don't know if you've noticed throughout the slides. I'm a big sports guy, and so I try to include as many athletes as possible. And we can kind of appreciate the diversity of Latinos and what they look like and where they're from. So just to quickly point out, this is Pele from Brazil. This is David Ortiz from the Dominican Republic. This is Saul Canelo Alvarez. He's a Mexican boxer. And here we have a Quechua woman from Bolivia. And here we have Mayan children from Chichen Itza in southern Mexico. All right. Now, if I haven't confused you enough, here is a giant map of the world. And what I did here was I kind of circled as best as I could the different categories of Hispanic or Latino. So as you can see here, the big circle in green are countries that could be considered Hispanic. I've also included Brazil in that circle because you can make that argument. And then here's Spain, of course, that is definitely considered Hispanic. And then I don't know if you can see down here in Western Africa, number 24 is Equatorial Guinea. That could also be classified as Hispanic people. And then the red circle is just strictly in the Western Hemisphere, and it's essentially everything south of the United States, but it does not include any country where the official language is English. So that would include like the Caribbean islands, and it does not include the Dutch colonies. And so I took you through these like two different definitions that are very similar, but there are also some slight differences. And so I guess it's important to ask ourselves, like, does it really matter, these terms, whether or not we use them interchangeably or separate? And so according to a 2011 study by the Pew Hispanic Center, the terms Hispanic and Latino are predominantly American conventions, with 51% of those surveyed saying that they have no preference for either. So the people that were surveyed were, of course, people of Hispanic or Latino origin. And then going along with that, 51% of the people surveyed prefer their family's country of origin over the pan-ethnic terms Hispanic or Latino. And this is primarily because if you use your country of origin, it's a little bit more specific. And going along with that, most Hispanics and Latinos surveyed in this study do not see a common culture among the US Hispanics or Latinos. So what that means is that rather than lumping all of the Hispanics and Latinos together, they see, depending on what country they're from, every country has a very unique and specific culture, and that ties into why they would prefer using their country of origin. So again, here, I'll just take you through the pictures quickly. We have here 3 soccer players. Luis Suarez is from Uruguay, Lionel Messi is from Argentina, and Arturo Vidal is from Chile. And here we have Selena, who was a Mexican artist. We have Marta, which is an international Brazilian soccer player. Fernando Tatis Jr. is from the Dominican Republic. And then we have the artist Bad Bunny here from Puerto Rico. And then lastly, but definitely not least, we have Lupita Nyong'o, who is Kenyan, but she was born in Mexico and would therefore could be considered Latino. And I think this is my last slide for Hispanic and Latino topic. And I just want to point out one thing, just the diversity that we see here among Hispanics/Latinos. And I think that's something we can all really appreciate, is just how different and unique everybody is. You know, they come in all sorts of colors and sizes. And I just want to leave you with that. And I will be turning over the second half of this conversation to Olivette.
All right. If you could go to the next slide. Perfect. Okay, so we learned about Hispanic and we learned about Latino. So what about Latinx? So just as a reminder, Latina or Latina is any individual who is a native of or descends from a Latin American country. So Latinx is a gender neutral or non-binary term to describe people who are of or related to Latin America origin or descent. So it's basically an alternative to Latino and or Latina, and the X in Latinx replaces the male and female endings O and A that are part of the Spanish grammar, the gendered Spanish grammar conventions. It incorporates those who fall outside of the male-female binary. So the pronunciation can vary from people to people. Some people pronounce it Latinx, other people pronounce it Latinx. And why do we use the term Latinx? Well, it's because it incorporates groups and communities that have been traditionally left out of the greater Latino umbrella. So the origins of the term Latinx are unclear, but it's generally agreed that this term stemmed from American-born Latino or Latinas who want to be more inclusive and gender neutral. Until the past several of years, there wasn't much usage of the term Latinx, and it first began to emerge on the internet in 2004. And if we look at this top graph, according to Google Trends, the first substantial rise in searches relative to all online searches appeared in June 2016 following the shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. And Pulse nightclub was an LGBTQ dance club that was hosting a Latin night on the date of the attack. And in the following years, as we can see, the Google searches of Latinx has grown substantially, and so has its use on social media by celebrities, politicians, grassroots organizations, and almost everybody. But if we look at the bottom graph, it still falls behind Hispanic, Latina, and Latino usage just based off of Google searches. So, although the popularity of the term Latinx is growing, very few Latinos actually use the term. A survey conducted by Pew Research Center on about 3,000 United States Hispanic adults in December 2019 showed that 76% have not heard of the term Latinx, 20% have heard of the term Latinx, but only 3% actually use the term. And from those who have heard the term, only one of them say that it should be to describe the Latino population. And in my experience, it seems like the term Latinx is more used in writing, especially on social media, rather than said orally in conversation, if that makes sense. So that might play part of it. So, as the term Latinx grows in popularity, so does the criticism against its use. There are several arguments as to why some people think the term Latinx is problematic, and I've outlined their critiques here. So, the term Latinx is basically a non existent term in many Spanish speaking countries and to many Spanish speakers. It's incomprehensible to many individuals, especially to those that are not fluent in English. And opponents of this term argue that for this reason, it does not provide a gender neutral alternative to Spanish speaking non binary individuals and to any older Spanish speakers who have been speaking Spanish for many years and would struggle to adapt to such a change in their language. Opponents of the term Latinx also argue that its usage can be seen as a form of linguistic imperialism and that it disregards the inherently masculine grammar used to describe all genders in the Spanish language. For example, Latinos, based on the context, can technically refer to all genders of Latin American descent, even though it's a masculine word in Spanish. And like another example is niños, although masculine, it can refer to a group of male and female children. And so opponents of Latinx term argue that under this idea, would other terms like niños or amigos need to be changed as well to conform to these social norms. And speaking of social norms, critics of this term also say that it imposes social norms on other cultures. And this critique stems from the concept that, or the context that English speakers or American born Latino or Latinas continue to impose their social norms on other cultures. And this can come off as offensive and an attempt to dictate their language to be structured to manage the social constructs around us. And I just wanted to make you all aware that although the term Latinx is growing in popularity, it does have some growing criticism against its use. But all in all, Latinx is a term used to promote inclusivity and diversity within a community, especially to bring visibility to the people from Latin America or those who have descended from Latin America that have been and are marginalized in our own culture. And here's just a final slide comparing the terms Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and Latinx. And I think that concludes our presentation.
Well, see, we have some questions in the chat. I'm interested to see your thoughts on these subjects. See, we got a lot of California people here. Cool, cool. Love California. All right, so I think the first question is from Kimberly Connolly, and she asked, my question to those who are fluent in Spanish, how do you feel about Latinx, which removes the masculine O? And I also want to mention, I want to open this up to everybody in this who's participating today. If you would like to either type out your thoughts, or you can obviously speak as well. But me personally, just like, the way I was raised and where my parents are from, um, I will typically use Latino. Yeah, Latinx is something that's still a little new for me. And so it's kind of hard for me to use. Um, and this is a very like subtle thing and it's not that important, but as far as when you're speaking Spanish, if you use Latinx, it doesn't flow as nicely. I'm sure my Latinx people that are in today's conversation, I'm sure you guys would agree. It is kind of difficult when you're having just a nice fluid conversation to kind of make that pause, if that makes any sense. We have a comment from Jason Glenn. It said, I also lived in Texas for 12 years before moving to KC. Interestingly, Latinx people in Texas seem to prefer the term Hispanic and were also offended by the term Chicano, Chicana. This is also reflected in their politics. The highest percentage of Latinx Trump supporters were in Texas, around 30%. That's interesting. Yeah. When we were preparing this presentation, Chicano, Chicana did come up a lot. And I'm not sure how to feel about that term because I know typically that definition refers to people of Hispanic or Latin American descent that were born in the US or that have spent a few generations here.
Yeah, that was the second part of a comment that has started earlier, in terms of how I think for some of us from California who've lived in California, there was a time when the term Chicano, Chicana really came to be preferred over Hispanic, and it was very much politicized. Folks would be angry with you when you use the term Hispanic and whatnot. And I was commenting on how different my experience was, there in Texas, where, when I would use the term, Latina, Latino, Latinx, or Chicano, Chicana, and people, would look at me like, I was weird and like I had a problem. And they really didn't like the term Chicano, Chicana, and they felt really offended by it.
Sorry, I thought Chicano only meant Mexican American. Am I wrong? Is it the whole Hispanic, Latino, Latinx?
It's for people who were born in the U.S. whose parents are from Mexican descent.
Yeah,
that's the original. But I think it's political. It's a very political term. So I wonder if there's, I don't know it, but I wonder if maybe there's like some different political views in Texas versus California, maybe, and people feel different about those terms.
I just, I generally felt that, and I don't want to, oversimplify or overgeneralize how all people felt in a region, because I realize how problematic that is. But, politically, as far as these kinds of discussions go, I just didn't find, people of Latin descent in Texas to be, very open in terms of, really thinking and deconstructing these terms and the terminology. It was all Hispanic all the time.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too that some of the research that Oliver was sharing, from that same article, I was reading that only 3% of people within the community use the term Latinx. So it seems that all these terms are classifications that are almost imposed on people, but they're not generally embraced by people. So the people that are being classified are not always sure how to use those terms, if that makes sense. And it's really, for me, telling, and maybe Jaime can comment on this more, how the meaning of the terms are so random, because in Spain, these terms mean totally something different than what they mean here. So when people refer within Europe to people from Spain or Portugal or Italy, they call them Latinos. And that, yeah, but people don't understand in Spain why people in Spain will call people from Latin America Hispanic. So it's just the randomness of the term. And I think it speaks to the fact that most times these categories are imposed on people and they're used to, and historically also to be able to count them within groups and maybe to access resources, because what we have to understand too is that before these terms existed, most of these people were classified as white, which also didn't represent their experience or right their lived experiences within the United States society, if that makes sense.
I think I agree with most of what has been said. I'm Mexican, and I remember coming to this country for college and being asked like, or labeled as white by someone else, like somebody put that label on me, and the health department, they decided that for me as I was coming in for my shots. The other thing I wanted to comment, this is a great conversation and thanks for having this presentation. I recently read a book called El Norte, the epic and forgotten story of Hispanic North America by Carrie Gibson. And it is an excellent book if you're looking into the history of why California, for example, has a great influence and Texas has a great influence in what Hispanic North America has become. It tells a lot of stories about why this the Hispanic was embraced, and it has a very huge political tone to it. So it's a very interesting book. It's not too old, it's very recent. So if you want to check it out, because it helped me understand a little bit more of that background and that historical context. And one of the things was related to Texas wanting to become a part of the Union when it, left Mexico for reasons that history has told, and not wanting to be included as a population because it had a lot of non-white people in it as a state. And so that was a huge contention as to if you're labeled white, then you're included in the majority and you have the privilege of that label. And so I think there has a lot to do with the differentiation and a lot of Hispanic or Latino to Latinx individuals wanting to be included in a larger group so that they could have the benefits. So anyway, I think that's a great book if you want to check it out. I learned a lot, but I'm still learning as a foreigner. So I'm always happy to have these conversations.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Leticia, because I was, I think I remember somebody telling a story about how they, the whole thing with Latinos and census, because you always think about the census and you have to put the race and then your ethnicity and all that, and that's complicated. I just hate that question because I can fill one out and then it's like, what's the next one? Where do I fit in? And like you said, that they label you white, because I remember somebody telling a story one time, and I forget where it was, in a conference, that they were two siblings, and basically when they were born, they were two different races, because I think one of the siblings was more like light skin, but they were both Latinos or Hispanic, but one of them was put as white, but then the other one was put as African American, because those were the two options that they had, even though both were, I think, parents were from the Dominican Republic. And it goes to say that, again, going to that diversity about this community, that some people you might, have the Hispanic or Latino, but then the race question, what do you put yourself? How do you label yourself? White, where do you fit that in? When I lived in Florida, I was really surprised to see a lot of Cubans that I work with, when they would fill out the census, they would say, why are you so confused? I'm just going to put white. And I'm like, really? That's the way that you put in yourself as your race being white. But they felt that way, because I know that a lot of them tend, and this is from my experience, again, I'm not, I lived there for 5 years. They felt a closer connection to Spain. Therefore, they felt more European, and they felt like, okay, I'm not one of those Latino, or the way they're labeling them. I see myself as this, and therefore that's my race. And so that tends to be complicated. In terms of the Latinx, I still feel a little bit uncomfortable using it for my own self. So when I introduce myself, I use more like Latina or Hispanic, because I could be either way. But I definitely feel sometimes that the older generation, you like that using those terms, because it's part of how the Spanish is. So you can't say, la silla, you can't say el silla, you have to say la silla, because it's part of how you put the feminine and the masculine into things. So I think sometimes the older generation, when you think about, what do you mean Latinx? Is it you're Latina or Latino, men or women? And they're in that category that it's hard to understand why is it so important to be more inclusive. And I think we're having those conversations, but it's also like they said in the presentation, how Spanish works, that it's, as you speak a language, I remember learning English and how you have, well, this is the way you pronounce something. You have to pronounce it this way, because if you pronounce it differently, you're not speaking it correctly. So it's like if you're speaking Spanish and you say something that as you're speaking it, it doesn't fit in how the syntax is, it makes it seem like, wait a minute, and am I speaking this correctly when it's supposed to be Latino or Latina instead of Latinx? And I grew up in Southern California, and for me, my understanding was with the Chicano term, there was a lot of movement to be that pride of where you're coming from and your descendancy. And I think I had a lot of some of my older professors or people that I met that they were part of that Chicano and Chicana, label that they put in themselves because they didn't felt American enough. So they wanted to embrace that part of themselves. And that was a way of making it feel, okay, this is who I am. I'm accepting who I am because I don't fit into just being an American because of all the stuff that happened, with even in the 4th of the Zoot Suit riots and all that stuff that they didn't fit well in that part of the country. So it's interesting to see, like you were saying, Texas and California, how a lot of people from Texas, it's like, well, we've been here for many years. We were even in our own country. And then we became part of the United States. So they have a different identity than the people from California. So just want to say that. Thanks.
Just to echo what you say, there's a colonial history to this as well. And just briefly, like Spain, Portugal, France, and England all had different conceptions of race that they implemented in their various colonies as they came to the Western Hemisphere. And the English were much more one-drop rule kind of conception of race, whereas particularly Spain and Portugal had all these intermediate categories. There wasn't just you were either pure white, and if you had any indigenous or African blood in you, you were considered, black or indigenous, right? That they just had, sometimes over a dozen intermediate categories for how they would categorize people. And so then, when we have all these descendants of these different colonial histories all here in the United States trying to fit into the English model of how race worked, we see that's where it just all really breaks down, right? Because race is not a biological category, of course, right? It's a social category. And as a social category, it's also political. That, as so many have alluded to, there is power in claiming the moniker and the label of whiteness, and there is still stigma in claiming, one's indigenous heritage and one's African heritage, right? And that's all a part of, how these labels are getting negotiated.
If I can add to that, yeah. So the fact that the Spanish had a much more, I guess, hierarchical form of classifying people based on race. I don't know if you guys have ever seen, there's a classic painting or image. It almost looks like a bingo card. I'm looking at it right now on my other screen, where it shows all the different combinations you can have of people. So you have a white male Spaniard with a mixed woman, or a white female Spaniard with an indigenous man, and it's just like all this combination, and there's a specific term for each one of those. And that kind of adds to the things that we're seeing over here in the chat, that race is very different. How people define race is very different depending on the country you're from. And I see that Juliana was talking about Brazil specifically, and I just remember from a sociology class when we were talking about race, how in Brazil, it almost seems like the system is a lot more complicated because you have so many different, I guess, shades of people. And yeah, it's not as like, oh, he's white and she's black and they're mixed, whatever. It's very, it's much more defined. And going back to my sports thing, the best way you can look at the demographics of a group of people is just looking at like their athletes. So I'm a big soccer guy. And so I always like looking at national team pictures. And going back to Brazil, if you look at the Brazilian national team, you see people of all different shades. You see blonde hair, blue-eyed athletes, as well as completely black. So very interesting to see. And I think that's probably why most Hispanics, Latinos refer to their country of origin as their preferred way of identifying themselves. Just because you don't have to run into that nuance of like, oh, well, how do you define race in this country?
Allow me, I have that graphic that Carlos just referenced to share my screen briefly. Can you all see that? I know the print on it is very small, but you know, there are no less than 16 different categories there of, you know, the various types of mixtures in terms of how they imagined race in all these very different ways. And I can email that and send it to anyone if they'd like to, you know, have it for their records, and you can Google it as well.
This is so interesting too. And I think when I see things like this, or I'm listening to people, these classifications are so political, because I go back and I think about when I fill out paperwork for the US government, and the first question that everybody gets is, are you Hispanic or not? So, and then from then it goes to different categories. So I don't know, like I wonder if other people who are foreign born feel the same way, but I think that this is where all the intersectional stuff comes in. I think that when you get here, it doesn't matter how I define myself. It matters how I see myself, but it's about how the other, or the people in the majority of power of making these decisions, perceive the group. And I think that people who speak Spanish are perceived in a certain way in the US in general. And even though we may see all these differences, I don't think that the general public or the general view is as comprehensive as the view that we have, if that makes sense. So it's a lot about how we are all put together in this group by other people somehow. So I don't know.
I agree, Maria. And then I was also going to comment about experiences that I have, because people will say like, oh, you're Latina, you're Hispanic, but you're Brazilian. And then also sometimes I had experience of going to a dentist, for example, and then I feel as Latina and white. And then I could see the person like, no, but this cannot match. Like this combination is not possible. And then even like doing research with Latinos, I feel like is a constant of teaching people that Latino is ethnicity and not race, that we can have Black or African-American Latinos, we have white, we have mixed Latinos, and that can impact on some results we see in research and health. And I think we are not targeting a lot of the even more underserved Latinos because we are not categorizing right. So yeah, I agree with you. And it's a lot about how people classify us instead of how we see ourselves.
And it's not just this particular ethnicity. I know that the term, for example, Black is a big deal also in medicine. Like when people talk about Black patient, or they write a case on a Black patient is very different. That patient is African-American and actually born in the United States, or if the patient classifies as African. And so there is so many implications of that on their health, that to use these all encompassing terms is just, is not accurate, right? And it's not good in general. Yeah.
Well, I think it always depends what you're using that category for. So the Latino Hispanic, as I think they mentioned this earlier on, was used as a way to have power in I don't know if it was Congress, I don't know exactly, but lobbying and coming together as a group to gain rights. So in that respect, I think it's very useful. Now, if we're using the same terms to the research, we're going to lose a lot of richness of data by just asking those questions the way, you know, the way it's being used for the census or for this or for that, you know.
I was just going to add that I feel like all of us have the room to grow and learn, because as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm just reflecting on just lifelong experiences from, you know, growing up in South Cali or Southern Cali, and transitioning to the Southeast portion of the US, living in Georgia, and just demographically, perspectives and viewpoints are very different. I remember just one experience where I saw a whole argument happen at McDonald's where the ladies working behind the counter were speaking in Spanish, and a customer they assumed did not know Spanish understood everything that was said. And when she made a comment back to them, responded back to them in Spanish, they looked at her like, because in appearance she looked Black, and she was like, no, yo soy dominicana, you know, and they're like, oh, okay. So even within populations, you know, there's still room to grow and learn that, you know, we all don't look just one way. We all don't, you know, from the US side of it or non-Spanish speaking side of it, you know, all is not the same. All is not, you know, there's different varieties, as you mentioned before. There's different ethnicities. We need to learn about each culture, each group, respect that, but also acknowledge that there's still room to grow and learn and not rely on assumptions.
I also noticed the way that I feel, you know, going back to Guatemala and, you know, growing up there a bit and seeing, I feel like when you live in the different countries in Latin America, there's more harmony with a lot of, you know, the different countries and the way we see each other. But then I think when people come to the United States, I've noticed based on, you start having that kind of competition between the different people from the different countries and knowing how they label you or where they put you in that map of trying to fit you into a box. That I noticed that I've seen based on when I go back and kind of come to the States, how within how the United States is and trying to put you in labels and try to see where you fit. I feel people kind of having conflicts between themselves or the different countries because what are the benefits that they get, or you know, I remember growing in Southern California, there was a big thing. Well, you know, Salvadorians and Mexicans don't like each other, but if I, you know, went to Salvador, they'd be like, oh yeah, we love, you know, Mexico, we love their music. But it was something that somehow when you come to the States, they're finding a way of, instead of unite you, make you be against each other.
Might have something to do with competing resources. And that's something that I've observed as an external person landing here as an already adult. I notice a lot of once you create these categories and you provide resources for them, well, this category encompasses a larger group within it. And so now we have like who has the biggest stake or who can actually lobby harder for those limited resources that have been allocated to that smaller group. So that was one of the things that always kind of crossed my mind, especially when I was in Arkansas. I looked at the Minority Health Commission. They have one that was established to provide grants for specific programs. And the competition was, you know, if you had the label of minority for whatever reason, then you're only competing with those groups. So it kind of pitted some groups against each other for that same funding. Which I don't know that that's the best way. I feel like it would have been better if they had an initiative that helped the most to the people that needed the most, regardless of what category they fell in. But it's hard. It's hard to keep a balance to give resources and help politically the groups that needed the most, the ones that are the neediest. And so that was something that I observed. That I was like, wow, that competition, it's probably not the best because it's divisive. Or maybe there's better ways to address that within this different groups.
in response to the Latinx thing that we talked about a while ago, I obviously like hearing it from people. I use it very seldom, rarely, but I obviously like that people use it, especially if I'm speaking Spanish. It, but obviously I welcome everyone who uses it. I would never complain about that, though. And maybe one day I adopt it as well. You never know.
I agree. It is not very natural for me. It's not something that, but I do think that language is very important and that it helps shape reality. And as much as I can, I try to correct myself and use it, because if it makes other people feel better, there's no reason why I wouldn't use it. Shouldn't use it. So I think it's going to be a process of adoption, but I actually see I hear more and more people using it, and I'm hopeful that it will be eventually adopted. I still think it will be a US reality. I don't think people in Latin America or in Spain are going to be going around saying Latinx or whatever variation of that is. I think it's a US term, and that reflects US reality, if you will, or the political or social context.
But even in Spain, we've had mild movements of people wanting to change the language and not speaking in masculine to do neutrals. I don't know if I explain myself properly, but you probably know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's very few people who actually speak like that, and I don't even know that it's accepted as if you wrote like that in an exam, they will probably subtract points from that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I don't think that's right, but
Like when I talk about myself, I use Latina, but I notice that when I do presentations or do stuff about the Latinx community, I go ahead and use that to be more inclusive of the research that I'm talking about, or so it helps to have that option of being inclusive, but also what are you using for your own self, because you can use that label that you want for your own self, but then to be more inclusive when you're talking to more people in that context, definitely using that makes it more welcoming and inclusive, especially coming from the LGBT community or having friends that they're transgender or non-binary. That definitely makes them feel as part of the conversation, and it's kind of being aware of that and how you use it when you're around friends or people that don't necessarily fit into one or the other and they're non-binary. It definitely makes it more inclusive when you're talking about them or to them.
So one thing I keep trying to do is I try to use Latinx when I speak in English, but it is difficult. Even in English, it doesn't sound really natural. But I wonder while we're speaking Portuguese or Spanish, if we could use like Latine, right? Because that's a sound we could all pronounce in our own languages, and then it could be more inclusive. I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I know that my husband, he went to UNAM, his PhD is from the University of Mexico, and so his professors, he's in philosophy, and his professors actually do use the amigue, todes, so the letter E instead of the O or the A. So I've heard those conversations. So there's some movement in that way, in the more academic, I think, similar to like research and whatnot. But I don't think it's widely used as some of you were saying. It would be interesting to see if that's something that we can get closer to. That I would hope so, because it really I really agree that I would prefer to use something, unless I'm corrected and somebody expresses to me what their preference is. Having a term that is more collectively inclusive is probably almost always better.
I have seen in writing, not speaking obviously, but in writing through WhatsApp with my family and things like that, that they use the X. So instead of like chicos or chicas, they would say chic and then an X and an S. Obviously, it's not something that you can say, but to me, it's signs that, you know, people are changing the way. I mean, at least it's an attempt.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, when I started my Alzheimer's Disease Center in Spanish Facebook page, I said todos instead of slash todos was an at. So todas contra el Alzheimer, right? Against Alzheimer's. So that was I've definitely used that before in that way. So yeah, we're getting there slowly, but getting there.
Carlos, I don't know if you have anything to say here at the end, but before we close down completely, everybody goes to their next 1 o'clock obligation. I did want to say a couple of things. One, as someone who's been involved in community conversations for a while, this was really a really good conversation. So thank you to everyone, especially our organizers, but all the conversation, Dr. Alonso, yeah, Dr. Glenn. And I wanted to just comment that little housekeeping, Alexa will be sending everyone an assessment link, as well as we'll comb through the chat and pull out all the great recommendations that were entered there. And you can look for that email, and that's for everybody who registered and attended today.
Kim, do you have an access to the other events that we're having too, or?
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Alexa, could you, is it possible for you to screen share that and just highlight the upcoming? Or do you want to just talk about it, Brenda, real quick?
Oh gosh, I don't have the list with me.
Okay.
But definitely I recommend you registering soon, so that way you can get the confirmation right away to get the Zoom link, because that's how you're able to attend, because I noticed some people had issues, and even I had issues yesterday. So you should be getting an email. If not, we should have your email to register since you registered for this, and we could include that and be able to send that email to you. But yeah, I was trying to see when you said that, I'm like, oh, I don't have it open. But I'm hoping that many of you, since you came to this event, you probably have gotten the email for the other events that are coming up. And we have a really great research day coming up October 14th. And we have a great, a lot of people are going to be sharing the research, and we have a really great keynote speaker that is going to be attending, and my mind just went blank on his name. But if anybody else, Jaime, would you like to add more to that about the research day that we're having? It's going to be great.
So we got about 20 people presenting. It'll be 5-minute pre-recorded presentations. Every 3 or 4, we're gonna have 5 minutes of Q&A. In the meantime, people can still chat, and those questions will also compute for the Q&A. And then at the very end of that day, well, I think Juliana is here as well, but we've got, is Juliana there?
Yes, I'm here.
You want to talk about the keynote speaker?
Yeah, so for this year, we will have Dr. Eliseo Perez Estable. He's the director of NIH, the Center for Minority Health. So we are very glad that he will come to present to us, and we would be very happy if you all can join us.
Our next event is a community conversation that's coming up on the, it's on the 29th, next Tuesday. So that'll be the very next. And that one is going to be specifically on COVID-19 related to the Latinx population. And Dr. Alan Greiner and Mariana Ramirez will be facilitating that conversation. So.
And the link is in the chat to the calendar. I just saw that it was put there. So if you want to just click on that link, and it has the different events that are happening, and definitely go and register so you can get the link to the Zooms and be able to join us. And we definitely look forward to seeing you in those events. And thanks for your support and attending.
Thank you guys so much for attending today. Really appreciate it, and adding such a depth beyond our short presentation. That was really cool. So thank you very much. And we know you had your choices of 12 o'clock lunch meetings, and we appreciate you choosing ours. Sound like
Great
an airline,
job.
but yeah.
Great job,
Good job.
Carlos. Yeah,
Thank
Great
you,
job,
Olivette.
Carlos.
all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Olivette too. Thank you so much
Yeah,
for helping
good
Yeah.
out.
job.
Oh,
For sure.
Olivette,
Thank you, Carlos.
wonderful job.
Take care. Have a good rest of your day.